Well, thank you all for being here. I know there are going to be a few more popping in as we go, but we're going to just go right ahead and get started because it is lunchtime and it is time for a lunch and learn. Um, I'm Rabbi Marisa James. Welcome to CBST. We are thrilled again to be partnering with the New Israel Fund for a lunch and learn about the impact of the most recent Israeli elections. And we are so thrilled to have with us friends, old and new, from the New Israel Fund. And one of them is also a very long-term CBST connection, Rabbi Ayelet Cohen. Could I invite you to just let us know a little bit more about the New Israel Fund for those who are not as familiar?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's so great to see you and to be with you in this way. And I'm really looking forward to being with you for real soon. So the New Israel Fund is the leading organization working for justice and democracy in Israel. We fund many organizations that are in the civil society sector, the non-governmental sector, that are working in different ways for social justice, human rights, economic justice. And we are, since our founding over 40 years ago, really partners with the entire progressive sector, including, of course, the LGBT sector in Israel, and working for equality and justice for all Israeli citizens, all Israeli residents, and everybody who is under Israeli control. Of course, it has been a tremendously tumultuous year everywhere, and of course, also in Israel. I don't know if you can say more than usual because there's no such thing as usual, but you'll get to hear from my wonderful colleague Elisheva about some of the latest, and specifically the impact of this new government and what we might be able to expect.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we will have Rabbi Cohen back with us on a more regular basis very soon. So I will be honest that I am totally thrilled about that. And we are, so thrilled to welcome Elisheva Goldberg. We have watched at CBST with great interest and not so little confusion as 4 different elections have finally resulted in an actual government, what we've been kind of waiting for to be able to even understand what might be next. And I will tell you, I will read Elisheva's bio, but I also want you all to know that she is one of the people who I look to when anything happens in Israel. I want to know if she has written about it. So we are very, very lucky to have her with us today. Elisheva is the New Israel Fund's Director of Media and Policy. She formerly served as parliamentary advisor to then co-leader of the opposition and former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni. And she's also worked at the progressive think tank Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy, of which I'm a huge fan, and as assistant editor at Peter Beinart's Daily Beast blog, Open Zion. And she's written for the Daily Beast, The Forward, The Atlantic, and is currently a contributing writer at Jewish Currents. And I really, truly recommend that you read anything that she writes. So Elisheva, we would love if you would start by just giving us an overview of how this government came to be.
Thank you so much, Anna and Marisa. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. I just want to say, it's like this, the noon hour is like an interesting hour to spend talking about Israel, but I'm grateful that you all joined me. And thank you to CBST in general for having me. So I'll just say the first thing that is the clearest thing about how this government came to be. Netanyahu, former Prime Minister Netanyahu, what a joy to say those words, was gumming up the democratic system in such a way that there was no way to form a government with him, essentially. And because of that, and also in addition, nobody wanted to go to 5th elections, as you said, Rabbi. There had been 4 elections already in 2 years. Nobody wanted to go to 5th elections. And so there was this cobbled together, strange bedfellows, dramatically different parts of the political spectrum coming together to form this government. And that's really the only reason why. I mean, the reason is because this was about Netanyahu monopolizing power and sucking up all the political air in the room. He had, I don't need to go into all of the sins of Netanyahu, but this election was really about yes or no Netanyahu, as were the previous 4. And Israelis answered, or at least the political echelon answered, it's not going to be Netanyahu this time. So that's how you get, Mansour Abbas, a conservative political Islamist, sitting with the annexationist Naftali Bennett, sitting with centrist Yair Lapid. right? The analogy that I've used in the past to describe what this is like a computer freezing, right? So it's like turning on and off the system. You know, that you turn it on again, the software is already installed. Like Israel has the parliamentary way of doing these things, but you need to go a little bit, back to basics. And I'll just say one word about Bennett also, and Lapid. So Lapid really gets a lot of credit for making this government happen. He was the orchestrator, the sort of brains behind it coming together, and he came out looking like the adult in the room. With the values that we recognize in some ways as liberal and democratic. And Bennett was the lucky guy who, with very few mandates, got to ride this, no Netanyahu wave into prime ministerial office. And Bennett, himself is kind of an amalgamation of different views. He's not as hardline as we kind of think he is. He is certainly an annexationist, but he's a nationalist, but he's not dogmatic. He is religious, but he's certainly not devout. He's a military man, but he certainly prefers the comforts of a civilian urban life, not the rough and tumble of the settlements. And he's a high-tech entrepreneur who is no longer looking to make millions, but rather influence the political sphere. So he's an interesting person to be sitting at the helm of Israel now. And I'll end with that, and we can move things along.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I also want to encourage everybody that as this is happening, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat, because when we get to the Q&A, we'll be able to address as many of them as possible, but feel free to just park them there as they occur to you. So what's different and what's new about this government? You touched on this a tiny bit already, but I'd love to expand on that a little bit. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to offer what I think are the 5 central opportunities and the 5 central risks of this government. And that's how I'm going to answer this question. So the first really amazing thing that we haven't had in 12 years of Netanyahu's rule is that there are actual open doors for organizations that are non-governmental, that are often grantees of the New Israel Fund, to be step not through the back door, but through the front door of the Knesset, and actually work to leverage power. And make real change on issues that we all care about on the progressive front. And the interesting thing there also is that the legislative moves may be stymied because it's such an interesting is a strange word. I would say bizarre. It's a very odd coalition of people who are sitting together. And so legislation may not be the first prime move, thing to go to, but the executive level with members of Knesset who are actually in the government, who are in power, who are sitting as ministers, having power for the first time from the progressive side of things. I mean, there are ministers from Meretz, there are ministers from Labor. These are people who have our values at heart and who have their hands on the controls. And so we might see real significant change for the first time in at least a decade, which is really incredible. Number one. Number two is that this is a historic moment for the legitimacy of Arab citizens as full participants in the political process. This is the first time that an independent Palestinian party is part of a governing coalition. It may not be, the Arab party that we wanted to be a part of the coalition. This is not our first choice. It's a conservative Islamist party that is a part of the coalition, but it's a precedent that can't be undone, and undoubtedly a win for democracy. Arab members of Knesset, Arab leaders of government, will no longer be related to as power brokers, they'll be related to as power brokers instead of token partners, right? Which is huge. Okay, number 3, and I'm going a little bit in order of importance. I think that the first 2 are really, really, really crucial. There are no ultra-Orthodox members of this government. This is number 3. And there are a lot of members of government who want to see things that have to do with the ultra-Orthodox community change. Now, this could, of course, change. The members of that community are often willing to make compromises and join governments for various reasons. So we could see that shift. It hasn't happened yet. And there right now aren't clear moves for that, but I just want to, caveat. And already things have happened, when it comes to money that goes to that community. So for example, Avigdor Lieberman of Israel Beitenu, who's for rightly or wrongly seen as a kind of like pushback on the Haredi interests, has already cut daycare subsidies for full-time yeshiva students,
and has required that each parent work for 24 hours a week, including the men, right? Not just the wives, but the husbands must work 24 hours a week if they're going to get the daycare subsidy that they have been provided until now. That is a dramatic change, and he's been called all kinds of names for that, anti-Jewish, taking away the, et cetera. But it's really significant, and it's a real incentive at the end of the day for ultra-Orthodox men to join the workforce in some way. Another example, and I'll try and be brief, is that the coalition agreement itself includes a reduction in age of conscription from 24 to 21. Now, this is a complicated one. I'm going to try and explain why it's significant. Young ultra-Orthodox men who would otherwise be conscripted just like everybody else go to yeshiva to allow them a special exemption from the army. And they have to essentially stay in yeshiva until the age of 24. And at the age of 24, they're exempt from conscription, right? So between 21 and 24, they're just sitting in yeshiva being exempt because they don't want to go to the army. This new rule will free them. Because they're exempt at the age of 21, right? Most Israelis go into the army at 18. So they could sit, let's say, in yeshiva from 18 to 21, but and then they'd be exempt and they could leave yeshiva. So instead of sitting in yeshiva for another 3 years, they can join the workforce or do higher education or do something that is not just sitting in yeshiva. So it's another push, hopefully, from this coalition that will, enable ultra-Orthodox men, particularly, to get a higher education or to go into the workforce. So that's a significant piece here. There are no ultra-Orthodox members of this coalition. Number 4, which is just important, we don't have to deal with Netanyahu. What an amazing thing, right? His divisive racist rhetoric, his attacks on the judiciary, his attempts to save his own political skin, all of those things are hopefully now his legacy. They're not things that we have to deal with on a daily basis, and he is not weakening Israeli democracy actively today because he's in the opposition and he doesn't have the power to control the lives of Israelis. So that I think is a really incredible thing. Also worth noting that he's still on trial for, bribery, fraud, breach of trust. This trial is ongoing, and we'll see where it goes. And at this point, it's a sort of sit back and watch. The final thing that I'll say, which is a strength and a weakness of this coalition, an opportunity and a risk. So the coalition's fragility, the fact that it is made up of all these very diverse pieces, is also its strength. So because the coalition depends on a diversity of voices, it can't govern without the input of Palestinian citizens of Israel. It can't govern without the input of centrists. It can't govern without the input of Meretz and Labor, of the left progressive flank. So there is a balancing act that's happening, but it's really an interesting thing that is the case. In the coalition agreement itself, Yair Lapid, who's going to be the prime minister, hopefully after Bennett in 2 years, and Bennett each have a mutual veto on the other's decisions. Neither of them is able to fire ministers who was not from their party, which is an unusual restraint of power for a prime minister who can usually fire whoever he wants from his minister's cabinet. Okay, those are the 5 opportunities. I'll just repeat them really quick so we have them all in our heads. Number 1, we have some open doors. We can walk in the front door on progressive issues. Number 2, there's an independent Palestinian party for the first time. It's a precedent that can't be undone. Number 3, there are no ultra-Orthodox in this party, in this coalition, excuse me. Number 4, no Netanyahu. And number 5, the coalition's fragility is also its strength. All right, moving on to risks. Now, we definitely cannot forget that this is not a left-wing government, right? This is not a left-wing government. Bennett is still helming it. Ayelet Shaked is still his second in command, and we're still, facing down some really right-wing policies. So I'd say that number 2 is that we have to remember that, when it comes to the West Bank, when it comes to issues that progressives care about Palestinian rights and under occupation, these issues are not likely to see very much movement, I would say. It's not likely to get better, or at least not too much better, for Palestinians in the West Bank. That said, we also have a Biden administration, which is a change. So that's a different front. But from the Israeli political echelon, that's unlikely to happen on its own. Number 3, so Ayelet Shaked, who is Naftali Bennett's number 2, is an interesting political animal all of her own, and was formerly the justice minister under Benjamin Netanyahu and worked really hard to circumscribe the powers of Israel's judiciary and to kind of put the Knesset and put the Knesset first in the balance of powers, right, where each is supposed to be a check on the other. Instead, she wanted the Knesset to be on top. What's more, she also she agitated for and got the basic law, the nation state law, which, as we know, was a very discriminatory law that downgrades the Arabic language, that states the Jewish sort of like the Jewish collective national rights as primary and singular in Israel. And so she's still around, and we should not forget about her. She's currently the interior minister, but in 2 years, she's going to become again the justice minister. And it's really important to know that not only, she appointed an enormous amount, like 300 plus judges in the Israeli judicial system while she was justice minister. And the person who's now justice minister, Gideon Sa'ar, is no liberal Democrat. I mean, he's a man of the system. He doesn't want to break it down, but he's a conservative guy. So we have Sa'ar as justice minister, and we'll have Shaked. And so any appointee that is going to be on the Supreme Court will have to go through them, and they have a lot of say. So we have to sort of be aware of where the judiciary's place in Israeli democracy is sitting right now. And it's precarious. Number 4 is that, of course, merits and labor, as much as they're balancing the power, can also be used as a fig leaf, in some sense, to cover for the right-wing impulses of the further right parties, like Yamina, which is Bennett's party and Ayelet Shaked's party, and Israel Beitenu of Avigdor Lieberman, right? We have to be wary of this tricky way of being in coalition. Finally, I think the really important thing to note that isn't exactly political, but is also political, is that there was an uptick is a really very mild way of putting it. There was a great deal of intercommunal violence, of interethnic violence that we saw in the last weeks and months in mixed cities, but also not just there. And it was really scary for everyone. And that violence and the lack of political response and the lack of proper police response, the over-policing that we saw as a result, endangers Arab-Jewish political partnership, which is a key for NIF in particular, a sort of core place where we put our emphasis. We think that this is one of the most important, if not the most important place to talk about what's happening in Israel today. And it's key to making Israel a sustainable democracy. So, because without it, what we will see is further segregation of communities, further separation, more Jewish supremacism than ever, discriminatory responses like we saw in this last round of violence with over-policing, and the sort of protection of dangerous Jewish people who are coming to protect the cities. But what that ultimately means is, act violently towards Arabs. So this is also not to minimize at all the violence that went the other way. I mean, there were synagogues torched and riots, and there were just terrible violence intercommunally, and that's a danger. That's a danger to political stability as well, in addition to it just being a very dangerous situation. Of course, now we're seeing the rulings coming down the pike about the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, so that's also sort of like will bring the tensions a little bit to the surface. And I think I'll end there because I've spoken enough, and I hope you've gotten a sense. I'll just recap the risks just really quickly. So the 5 risks, let's remember this is not a left-wing government. Bennett, and when it comes to the territories, not much is likely to change for the better. Ayelet Shaked is still a threat to the Israeli judiciary's legitimacy. Labor and merits could be used as a fig leaf for right-wing impulses. And 5, there is intercommunal violence that could very much upend or at least damage what we're trying to build, which is Jewish-Arab partnership.
Yeah, thank you. Those are incredible. That's a wide range of points that are all really helpful to consider. And definitely, this is a lot of the questions that we've been, for those of us who are in the WhatsApp group, like a lot of the articles we've been sharing and questions we've been asking, I think are touched on by a lot of these points. Very, very helpful. So this was a lot about like kind of the impact of this government and the lack of potential impact of this government. And I love you're sort of, well, if Lapid takes office in 2 years as the prime minister, what that might be like. It is very hard at this point to imagine an Israeli government lasting that long, which is also sort of baffling to think about. How do you do any kind of how do you have any kind of long-term progress in the political world when the political world is so constantly turning over? Thank goodness for NIF's grantees and the NGOs who are in it for the long term and who are not necessarily, who are dependent in some ways and not in other ways on who is currently in the government. But what do you think are some of the ramifications for the work that some of the NIF grantees are doing with having this new government? You had mentioned that the open door, that people being able to come in to the Knesset and make requests and work with people. But what does that mean specifically? We kind of a little bit about shared society, but especially some of our questions have been around LGBTQ plus communities and other minority groups in Israel. And what do you think some of the ramifications are for these groups?
Sure. It's a great question. There's so much that shifts when Netanyahu falls in some sense, and there's so much that shifts when you have this government that you sort of are, it's a strange animal and you don't know if it'll last. Although just to that point, I think for the government, for this strange bedfellows government, it is in everybody's interest that it last, especially Bennett's. And I'll just say one word about that, which is that, Bennett in some sense abandoned his constituency in making the deals that he did and in becoming prime minister. And so he's a man in some sense in search of a constituency, which makes him both a little wild, but also maybe he's looking for constituencies that are not as hard right as his constituency was. I mean, he took over, he tried to be the sort of like, he tried to expand a certain element of the right, and it didn't always work, but he's, now he's a little bit of a free agent. So I think that there's some opportunity there, even as he's not our favorite prime minister. So that's just a small point. So in terms of, the ramifications for NIF's work and for, people on the ground, I just want to 2 points on the background and the sort of geopolitical, I think, and political context here, which is that, these are not safe times for members of the LGBTQ plus community, right? The world has sort of undergone what we call at NIF a democratic recession, in which the likes of, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Donald Trump here, and of course our former prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, who have run hate-filled campaigns that attack anybody who's not like them, immigrants, asylum seekers, the left, Muslims, Arabs, Jews in some cases. But these kinds of leaders are not always satisfied with xenophobia, national chauvinism, and they, LGBTQ plus communities have been also identified as foreign actors. Last month in Hungary, there was a law which passed with an insane majority of 157-1 that prohibited the sharing of any content that portrays being gay or transgender. So what I'm trying to say is that these anti-democratic regimes have proven that even if their dangerous populist rhetoric doesn't begin with the LGBTQ community, it can certainly end there. So that's the sort of global point that I think is really worth making, that these are not safe times. The first, now scary, but they're right now in Israel, because of this bizarre coalition that we've got, we have somebody like Nitzan Horowitz, who is a leader of the Meretz Party, a good friend of NIF, and an openly gay minister, now helming the health ministry in a time when all eyes are on the health ministry because of COVID. So he is an ally and somebody who can get things done, right? So we're talking about like our organizations having a direct line to his office. These are doors that are, again, this is the front door I'm talking about. So this is also just to give you a sense of what he is up to and what he has been up to. So Nitzan Horowitz is is probably the top advocate for the abolition of conversion therapy, which has an unfortunately widespread reach in Israel. He's introduced a bill that would abolish it, and that bill passed its first reading, but in Israel there are 3 readings, and so the bill still has a long way to go. But the way he talks about it and the platform that he has now are really different. So he talks about conversion therapy in terms of pikuach nefesh, in terms of saving lives, or abolishing it rather, in terms of saving lives, right? This is real for him. And he uses the language that's a religious language, frankly, but also the language of health. right? This is a mental health issue that we cannot allow to continue. So that's just one area that he's sort of leading the charge in a big way. And he's also spoken about advancing the rights of the trans community in Israel, offering health services, which are at his fingertips, and specialized care, working to reduce like the far too prevalent violence against that community. So, that's a second example. And those are areas that NIF, has obviously supported and will continue to support. Opportunity number two, there's a certain level on which issues are about the government, and a certain level on which issues are about public perception, right? And so it's undoubtedly the case that even during Netanyahu's rule, that the LGBTQ community in Israel has made significant strides in the eyes of the Israeli public. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is obviously the court ruling recently about surrogacy that, the top court of Israel enabled gay male couples to undergo the process of surrogacy in Israel, which was a pretty significant, it was no, marriage equality in America, but it was a very significant ruling. And that's also about public perception. That also sort of like bolsters the sense that this community is fully legitimate, can do the things that everybody else can do. I'll also say that manifests in pride parades in some sense, right? So like, and the newness of certain cities having pride parades and planning to continue them is not insignificant. So for example, this year, for the first time, Elisheva, a city that is, pretty conservative, held a 3,500 person pride parade. It was a little bit dicey at the beginning. There were some like violent attacks, but those people were arrested, those people were taken away, and the pride parade went on. And that's just something that has not happened before, and that's new and exciting. There was also for the first time, and this is an interesting and tricky subject for progressives, a pride parade in the settlement of Ariel. Ariel is the fourth largest settlement in the West Bank. And it's one of the most difficult for any peace agreement because it's very deep inside of Samaria or the top of the West Bank, the sort of northern section of the West Bank. And, it was tricky. For some people who came to this parade from settlements nearby, I saw quotes that said, "I thought I was the only queer in the Shomron." No, this was a huge thing for them. It was a real moment where they were like, there are other people like me. That's amazing, right? That's an incredible moment. But at the same time, for those of us who oppose the occupation and don't think settlements should be where they are, we sort of have to figure out, what to do with that, and it challenges us. So of course, LGBTQ people should be protected and should be, publicly, speaking out for their own rights everywhere. But it's tricky. So I would say that those are the two kind of like top line things that are happening in Israel right now. And I do want to talk about the political risks and the political challenges that have to do with LGBTQ rights. So the first one that's really interesting and really confounding and also challenging is that this is the issue that broke up the joint list in some sense. So the Arab Joint List was a coalition of four parties that ran together, basically saying we're stronger together. But it was a tricky coalition because it included the Islamists, right, who are now in government, and it included the ostensible communists, the sort of the left-wing flank of the Arab constituencies. And in June of last year, we're talking about a year and a bit ago, members of the Joint List, there was a vote that split the list. They voted on actually the bill to abolish conversion therapy. And 3 members of the left-wing flank voted to abolish conversion therapy, while Mansour Abbas, who's now the head of Ram, which is a part of the coalition, voted against it. Because, for his religious, ethical, cultural mores, that's actually a good way to go. So that's really challenging, and it exacerbated a wedge that already existed in the Arab community and in the Arab constituency, there's an interesting story behind this, that there's a popular brand of tahina called Al-Ars. And the head of this tahina company that a lot of Arabs buy donated some money to one of Israel's flagship LGBTQ rights organizations called the Aguda. And consumers threatened to boycott, supermarkets removed it from shelves, but one of the Hadash MKs, one of the members of the progressive flank of the Arab community, came out very strongly in defense of al-Ars and said, you know, LGBT rights are human rights. She called on people to buy the Trina, but the Ram MKs, the conservative Islamists, were like, no, I think people should boycott. Like, we don't think that this is right. We don't think you should support this community. We don't even recognize it as a community, basically. So that's actually a real tension in the Arab constituency. And what it did was it broke away, it helped break away. I wouldn't say it was the thing, because the thing was the tempting Netanyahu did of you know, part of that list, and he broke them away. And ultimately that breakaway led to the joining of this coalition that didn't have Netanyahu in it. But that's where the Arab community is on this, and it's really a divisive political issue. So that's really interesting, and it also actually leads to some tensions in the coalition now, even though the joint list itself, the like progressive aspects of it are not in the coalition. Meretz is, and Meretz has those politics. So you know, when the coalition agreement was being signed and discussed and negotiated, Nitzan Horowitz, our friend, said, this coalition is going to do everything it can to support LGBTQ rights. And Ram was like, wait, what? I'm sorry, did I hear you right? Because I don't think we're going to do that. So it also became an issue of tension then. And so the status quo on that is sort of being held. And Ram has said, because this is how they operate, that they're going to address every issue as it comes. So we'll see. The other thing that's worth talking about and is really interesting, but is also fairly marginal, but I think is worth saying, is that there's a party in Israel called Noam, which is this virulent, explicitly anti-gay party that is there to, quote, protect the family. And there is one member of Knesset from Noam that is in the Knesset right now. They're not a member of the coalition, but they're a member of what is also like a combination list with Bezalel Smotrich, who's also a far-right member. You know, he's the leader of this grouping. And it's an interesting party. They formed originally, I think, as an NGO, and they decided that to become more relevant, they would become a political party. But we're talking about people who, for all intents and purposes, are deeply puritanical and sort of radically so. They see the LGBTQ community, secular culture, the New Israel Fund, and you know, anybody who disagrees with them essentially as people who are pulling Israel away from its Jewishness and who are trying to, you know, dilute its character and are foreign infiltrators. They don't see secular culture or LGBTQ people or the New Israel Fund as sort of like native to Israel. They see them as foreign elements. And they in fact, they even compare the forces of secular life and Jewish, you know, pluralistic communities, the Reform community, to Nazi Germany. Because what they're saying is that these, right, they're really radical and they're really crazy. But it's worth mentioning because they do have, for the first time, this radical element has one member in the Knesset. They only got that member because the religious Zionism faction needed to build itself out. It also contains, you know, the Meir Kahana's legacy politicians. It contains, you know, Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Jewish Power Party. So we're talking about like the right of the right of the right, and they don't have power because they're not in the coalition, but they are there. So just worth mentioning. And I think probably I'll end there and I'll wait for questions, but I'm happy to answer anything that I've talked about or even that I've not talked about.
Thank you so much. This piece about kind of anything that people don't like being accused of being foreign elements always sort of cracks me up, because Jewish life in Israel is 90% foreign elements from this generation or previous generations, right? Like Zionism was created in Europe. So I kind of amused by, you know, well, that was imported, everything was imported, it's fine. But this is all incredibly helpful. And so yeah, please, I mean, I've already seen a few questions come in the comments. I'm gonna start there. Please continue to put any questions that you have for Elisheva in the comments. So the first question we had was, how do you think the new government is going to deal with diaspora Jewry?
That's a great question. there's definitely a move to be more open to diaspora Jewry. The Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Nachman Shai, I believe, has sort of said that as soon as he can, he's going to re-up the Kotel deal. And that has sort of been, I think, for Israeli politicians at least, the sort of central question of how we relate to American Jews, with good reason, right? Like, it is the place where if you're coming to Israel and if you're going to be in Israel for one day, you're going to probably go to the Kotel, right? That's sort of like what I think many, many American Jews feel. Obviously, we all have complicated feelings about the Kotel, especially now, but there was a deal on the table that was struck. And Naftali Bennett himself is an advocate of this deal. So the chances of this actually going forward are high, of creating an egalitarian prayer space at the southern side of the wall. That being said, there are also, other right-wing NGO elements that are going to try and stop it. And so it's going to be a little bit of a battle. But I actually think that there's more room on that particular issue right now than there has been in a long time. More broadly, it's a good question. It's hard to know. I mean, if the Ben and Jerry's incident was any indicator, many members of the government and many members of the opposition are going to continue to relate to American Jews in the same way that they have, which is with very little understanding, with not a whole lot of understanding. And I can talk more about that, but I'm not the most optimistic about that.
I will say, between the tahina and the ice cream, it sounds like we could do an entire session just on like the politics of food.
Absolutely.
The next question that came in, is there any concern that this Islamist party, the Muslim Arab party that is currently in the coalition, will have enough influence to cause pushback on LGBTQ issues?
It's a terrific question. There's a lot of interests that are at play in that question, in answering that question. So, on the one hand, there could be things that the left would push that would break their resolve to stay in the coalition. But right now, like I said before, and I think particularly for this Arab party, it is in their best interest to stay in this government at almost any cost. So, there are issues that, like if Nitzan Horowitz, this is a hard one to answer because I don't actually know. When somebody like Mansour Abbas, who's an incredible pragmatist and takes everything as it comes, right, decides on an issue, it's anybody's guess, which way he'll go in some sense, because it depends on the ways the winds are blowing at the moment. If there's a deal that can be made, right? One of the things that Mansour Abbas got out of the coalition deal is he extracted a promise that there would be a handful of Bedouin settlements in the Negev, Bedouin villages that have been there for a very long time that would be recognized in Israel, right? What that means is that they would be connected to water, they'd be connected to electricity, they'd be connected to basic infrastructure, potentially roads, right? That these communities that have been there for a long time and have not had access to those resources would gain access to those resources and no longer be under the threat of demolition, right? To extract that came at a cost for other members of the coalition who are very angry that, these Bedouin think of Israel as their own Wild West, and they're not playing by the rules, and have all of these other claims against, or reasons why they don't think that these villages should be connected to all of these resources, and think in fact that they should move to other cities that are being built for them, but also have their own problems, obviously. So, but they made that deal. So that deal, he got that extracted promise. And the right-wing members lost, but he didn't. We don't know what the actual conversation was initially, how much he conceded. So there was a lot of blowback, frankly, from the Arab community, being like, all you asked for was a handful of villages. Like, we have hundreds of these villages that need, and NIF is a huge supporter of NGOs that do the work to try and get these villages master plans, to try and get these villages, any kind of political leverage they can get so that they don't get demolished. And we've been working at this for years. And the question is, well, A, is this actually going to get done? And B, why didn't you ask for more? And the answer really is because it's a negotiation. So at the end of the day, the question of is there going to be movement on the LGBTQ question legislatively or in some kind of deal will depend on how much they can get back on other issues. So it's very much, sort of an in the weeds question, which is why I can't actually give you a full answer.
But that's a helpful answer in terms of some of the dynamics to be watching for. And I was thinking of it in terms of some of the Haredi parties, which are now not in the government, and right, like where they were or were not able to have influence. And I wonder if this will follow similar lines or not, for some of the reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah.
A wonderful point. Aren't the politically conservative organizations, NGOs, also many of them not internal to Israel, like JNF, right? If NIF is being accused of being an outside actor, right? That
which it's not, for the record, right? We have
truly.
Yeah. This is an organization that runs, all of its stuff is in Israel. Like all of the work that we do is on the ground every day.
Exactly.
But yeah, of course, American Jews donate tons of money to Israel in all kinds of ways, and it's all, none of that is considered illegitimate.
Right. I remember you go into any yeshiva or synagogue in the West Bank, and there's plaques all over the place donated by Morton Silverman of Miami. I just made that up. If you actually know a Morton Silverman,
John Hagee of QFI donated a swimming pool, as I recall, in Ariel, I was mentioning before. I mean, it's
right. Christians United for Israel, by the way, just to get that acronym out there, right? Christians United for Israel, the idea of being more upset about Jews in the rest of the world trying to fund positive change in Israel than Christians, who are, some of them, very excited about the idea of potential apocalypse. I worry about that.
Yeah.
I'm going to put some of these questions together. We had a question about, the Beersheba Pride March. Were there LGBTQ Ethiopians participating in that Pride March, or frankly, I'd be curious, any of the Pride Marches? And I'll parallel with that with a different question about, do we think the new government might finally bring home the last remaining Jews from Ethiopia?
That's an interesting question.
Ethiopian Jews in general kind of gets. Yeah,
I think that there's a chance. I don't actually know the answer to that question. I have not followed it closely enough, frankly. But I don't also know the answer to your question about whether or not there were Ethiopian Jews marching in Beersheba. There may have been. It would not surprise me, but I honestly, I wasn't there, sadly, so I don't actually know. But yeah, there are members of this government who are Ethiopian Israelis, and who will certainly push for, I think, bringing much of the rest of the community back. It's all complicated and political at the end of the day. But the other thing that community really, really is pushing for right now is like similar to what the Black community is asking for in America, which is stop killing us. I mean, there was a lot that was going on, especially right before the pandemic, with these communities who were protesting the police violence against their communities in really, really serious ways. So that's another sort of piece that these kinds of ministers, the Ethiopian ministers, but also their allies, will be pushing for in this government. Hopefully we'll see movement. I think that that's something that isn't terribly controversial, frankly, for the political right or the political left. And I think that that's actually a place where movement is not impossible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another, I'm going to put two more together. The more specific piece, how will the new government deal with Ugandan Jews who have converted under the conservative movement? And more broadly, do you think the new government will make any progress? And I know this is only partially a government question, in relating to non-Orthodox conversion being considered valid.
Yeah, so we just had this high court ruling where the government said that conversions by conservative and reform rabbis are valid. So it's really going to divide religious communities. And there's going to be a lot of conversation about what that really, really means and how that's going to happen. Because until now, unless you were converted outside of Israel and you could prove that and you could bring your conversion into Israel, you could prove it really with an Orthodox backing, you were not going to be recognized. But now it is true that from outside of Israel, Rabbi Ayelet Cohen can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but I believe that it's only for people who were converted outside of Israel that reform and conservative conversions are now holding in Israel, or the opposite. Actually, I apologize for this. I think that it might be the opposite. The reform and conservative conversions inside of Israel will be valid, which is a very small community. I think that's actually Rabbi Cohen. Is that correct?
So currently, they are holding. Conversions created outside of Israel are holding,
right?
Unless the rabbi is specifically on a blacklist of the Rabbanut. But while it changes it doesn't mean that on your identity card you can necessarily have your nationality be Jewish. So it's kind of semi-acceptable. It's acceptable for Aliyah, for moving to Israel, but it's not necessarily accepted for other issues of Jewish status. It's very, very tenuous. And this is something that's been used as a political football, as we know, through the last number of years.
Right. Those other things being things like marriage, right?
Marriage, divorce, burial.
Central things to people's lives, right? So you can make Aliyah, but unless you can't get married, which is tricky. Yeah.
And this is I think the question of like where some of the personal status issues being primarily under the umbrella of the Rabbanut versus under the umbrella of the state, right? In the United States, we're so accustomed to when you get married, it's a state document. It's not that, if I perform someone's marriage, it's as an agent of the state that it's recognized. It's not because there's some chief rabbi who's validating who I am and making that thing valid. Whereas in Israel, there's a Rabbanut, there's a chief rabbinate under which these personal status issues are navigated. And the Knesset, actually, the government actually does not have authority in those matters. And I think that split is something that we're not quite used to here.
Right. It's also why
this might go without saying, but I think it is important to say that probably any of us on this call, whether we would be interested in a same-sex marriage or an opposite-sex marriage, it would not be available to us to do it the way we wanted to do it through the Rabbanut, through the official rabbinate. That any of the marriages, as far as I know, that any of us on this call may have been a part of, would not have been recognized by the Rabbanut. And so you're also in this gray zone where you feel married, you're religiously married according to your Jewish tradition, but it won't necessarily be recognized by the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate in Israel.
Right.
And I feel like the two of the places where this is kind of, I think in some of these questions, two of the places where this is most visible, that there's this separation. And the reason why a lot of people go abroad for some of these personal status things is, one, the question about Jews in Uganda who have been converted through the conservative movement. And, they have a clearly harder time getting recognized than, say, somebody who converted in the conservative movement, who is, let's say, white and American. And so, how there's a different way of approaching people who are saying that they are Jewish, who have different types of documentation of being Jewish, from different countries and from different races, and in terms of who has an easier path in and who doesn't. And then also in the LGBTQ community, to be honest, this question of surrogacy, the question of gay Israeli couples having a child abroad, and whether they have an easier or a harder time being able to get some sort of Jewish status for their children, either before they move back to Israel with the child or after they're already back. I feel like those kind of dynamics are interesting as well.
Yeah, it's unfortunately complicated is also part of the answer. But the one quote that sticks with me that I read recently was something like, in a country where marriage between members of different religions doesn't exist, it's really hard to imagine a marriage of two people of the same sex. Like it's just, there's not so much room for that kind of thinking because of the monopoly of the rabbinate, which is also why the movement feels small. The surrogacy issue was a big issue and a huge point of advocacy because they thought that they could get movement on it, which they did. But on the sort of more basic questions, it's much harder to get movement. And that comes from, honestly, from Israel's founding, when the status quo was calcified. There's this thing called the status quo, where the rabbinate got the power that it has today in 1948 from Ben Gurion, in part because Ben Gurion didn't think that the ultra-Orthodox would be so powerful. He thought he was giving them a bone. And in fact, he was giving them the keys to people's lives.
So I want to move to a different topic. We've got two different questions that I feel like also fit nicely together around diplomacy. What is your assessment of the current diplomatic relations with the Biden administration? And do you think there's any likelihood of Israel establishing diplomatic relations with more Arab states?
Yeah, great questions. The first one is really the Arab states. I would say harder to tell. With the Biden administration, there's some interesting stuff. I would say that they're friendlier. I would say that they're friendlier than they would have been certainly if Netanyahu had been in power and he had been the one sort of making these connections. I'll also say that Netanyahu, just to give us a little bit of contrast, Netanyahu took away basically or diminished the power of the foreign ministry really significantly and kind of took the portfolio of the diplomatic corps onto himself, which is not a good move. It's not a good managerial move, and not a good use of his time necessarily, and not professional. So he was sort of like fielding all the phone calls from diplomats as opposed to the professionals in the actual ministry that was meant to do this work. And the power is shifting back. Bennett is a bit of a weak prime minister for all of the reasons that I described, but it's actually good for the institutional, world, like constellation around the prime minister to have the powers that they have, because that's how an executive really works and functions. So the foreign ministry is sort of like on the up and up a little bit. And I would say that in terms of actual relations, so Bennett is coming to the US probably in August. Preparations for that are currently being made. An advance team has already arrived in DC. And, Biden is willing to play ball with Bennett. Of course, he's, for example, they haven't reopened a consulate in Jerusalem at Bennett's request until the budget passes. Right? The big test of this government is going to be to pass a budget, which is Israel has been thirsty for now for years. Israel hasn't had a formal budget. So things have been passed ad hoc, but there needs to be some kind of like stability to that, to the finances of the country. So that's when everybody has to vote yes. And so nothing controversial, hopefully. Bennett's trying to prevent anything controversial from happening until then. So it may be controversial for his right flank to open a consulate in Jerusalem, or for various reasons. And so he's asked the Biden administration not to do that. And the Biden administration has seemingly complied. So that's the kind of relationship we're talking about. We're talking about like, okay, we can walk down this aisle together. We'll see what happens. I also think that this administration is going to be far more vocal on issues. This is what I mentioned earlier at the top. It's going to be far more vocal on issues of occupation and of Palestinian rights. It may not be an Obama administration in the same way, like calling out every single outpost, but it's definitely going to be back channeling that way, right? And I think that we've also seen Biden do the thing where he tried to get in the back door, and then when he couldn't, he would say something more public. And that's the dynamic that I think we're going to see. I think we're going to see some pressure, but it's unclear to me, when and where that pressure is going to come. I think it is the job of, frankly, progressive American Jews to make our voices heard and to let the Biden administration know that what we think and why we think it, so that they'll do the right thing and tell Israel that they can't get away with, the every part of the occupation that is harming Palestinian rights every day.
Thank you. I'm going to pull one more question before we close, and I'm actually going to expand this question. Shep wanted to know, do you think there's any chance of having a Mizrahi prime minister anytime in the future? And as I was looking at this question, I'll be honest, I was just thinking about like the most recent American presidential election and the fact that we had women candidates, candidates of color, LGBTQ candidates, and that we had like the most diverse candidate pool for president in the history of the US. And then looking at the new Knesset and seeing this wild diversity of ministers that has expanded, of having LGBTQ ministers in the health ministry, having Arab ministers, all the different range. So I want to take that question about the possibility of specifically a Mizrahi prime minister and ask, like, what do you think about like the building power of minority groups in the Knesset in Israel?
It's a great question. I don't know. I mean, there have been heads of like Moshe Kahlon, who was the head of a party for a while, wanted to be prime minister. He was definitely saw himself as a candidate. Right now, in the political, on the tops of the political parties, if Bibi Netanyahu stays where he is, we still really only have Ashkenazim as the top dogs. People have talked about Ayelet Shaked as a potential prime ministerial candidate. That would be a diversification from having men. It would be, like the second only to Golda. But I don't see it in the current political constellation. That does not at all mean that it's not possible. And I shy away from predictions, so I'm not going to say like I think in 10 years we're going to see. No, I don't know. But I don't think it's impossible. Not at all. Not at all.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank everybody for your fantastic questions. And I know it sounds like we already have multiple programming ideas for the future that have been popping up, some of them publicly, some of them privately. And Elisheva, thank you so much for this very wide-ranging response to all sorts of things. And I think I already have been making notes about some of the things that I'm like, oh, I'm not sure if we know enough about this. We should have a break-off program about all kinds of different pieces of this. As you say, so many things that maybe even seem simple on the surface still have so many different levels to them and so many different groups involved and so many different dynamics that, maybe we do and maybe we don't know about. That it is truly endlessly fascinating, and we're very, very grateful for all of the explicating that you walked us through this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you for being in conversation with me. It's always fun to talk to you.
Really a pleasure, and thank you, NIF. Thank you to the entire Middle East and Me team, and especially to our chair, Judy Hollander, for helping organize this. And we are always happy to hear if there are other topics that you would like to hear about, to learn about, to have a lunch and learn about, to have an evening program about. Please let us know. We have a collection of things that we've pulled together over the last few months, but we know always more to learn. All right. Well, thank you so much to everybody, and I hope we will see you all very, very soon.